You can very clearly see gender and mortality, which is a subject that we've been discussing in the stream since the morning, but now we have a special concentrated attention to it. And you can see the authors, and Lisa and Teresa. Are you both going to present, or Lisa will?
I will present, but I think Teresa will be in the audience. She will watch.
Yeah, you'll both answer questions, I guess. Okay, well, take it away. And we have about 15 minutes, but you can run over a little. Okay.
That's great to know. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Judith, and welcome everyone. So thanks for joining this talk. So today I'm going to be talking about, well, as has already been said, gender and mortality in Russia, a decade of lifestyle changes. And this is a joint paper with my supervisor, Teresa, and we are from the Erasmus School of Economics in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Oh, yeah, this works. So just a quick overview. I'm first going to introduce the topic, then I'll go quickly over the data and the methodology that I'll be using, then onto the results, and in the end I'll conclude, and I'd like to open the floor for questions and discussion. All right, so then first of all, we know that the gender gap in mortality is well documented. So there have been many studies which consistently show that women virtually all around the world live longer than men. And there's also been many studies which have tried to explain this gender difference in mortality. And I think it is interesting to see that the gender gap in mortality or the gender gap in life expectancy is especially striking in Russia. So that we can see here in this graph. So what we see here is life expectancy at birth in Russia. We see it from 1960 to 2018, and these data are from the World Bank, I should say. And then we see two lines. So we see a line for male life expectancy, the black line, and we see a line for female life expectancy. And immediately, if we look at this graph, we see that there really is a large gender difference in life expectancy in Russia. And even in 2018, this gender gap in life expectancy still exceeded 10 years. So I think that's really a large difference. So just to give an example for comparison, so in the Netherlands in 2018, this difference was only 3 years. Oh, and if we then look at the graph, we also see that in general, life expectancy, especially male life expectancy, is pretty low in Russia. And we also see that there have been these very steep declines in life expectancy. So here after the fall of communism, and again here in the early 2000s, I would say. And we see that mostly in this case, male life expectancy is affected. So we see less of movement in female life expectancy. And this then also means that in these periods, the gender gap in life expectancy is larger. But luckily, since this dip in the early 2000s, it seems that life expectancy, and especially male life expectancy, is on the rise. And this also translates into a smaller difference, smaller gender difference in life expectancy. So there have been many papers which have tried to explain this sort of mortality crisis. So this really the steep decline in male life expectancy after the fall of communism, and also in this dip in the early 2000s. And most of these studies really point to the unhealthy lifestyles of mostly working class, middle-aged Russian men. And then especially their high level of alcohol consumption, and also that for a large extent, they drink hard liquor, and also the high prevalence of smoking, and of the high prevalence of smoking among Russian men. And these are really sort of shown as the main culprits for fostering this high male mortality. And even now, or up until very recently, Russians were one of the largest consumers of alcohol in Europe. And I still think Russia has one of the highest smoking rates in the world. And this is mostly due to the smoking rate among Russian men. And well, I think partly in response to this, the Russian government has, I think since 2003, implemented alcohol and tobacco control regulations, sort of in response to these unhealthy lifestyles. And well, some recent studies show some suggestive evidence that these regulations might have been effective in reducing mortality, and especially in reducing male mortality. But well, as of yet, I think not so much is known about the changing contribution of gender differences in lifestyles to the gender gap in mortality in Russia. And this is what this paper tries to investigate. So basically, we're going to use decomposition analysis to decompose the gender gap in mortality in Russia into relative periods. And we're going to decompose this using lifestyles. And the periods that we're going to be looking at is the early 2000s and basically the gender gap a decade later. So why do we pick these two periods? Well, because we saw here in this graph that here in the early 2000s, there's really this dip in male life expectancy, and there's a large gender gap. Whereas a decade later, we also know that these regulations have been taking place for a while, and we also see that this gender gap in life expectancy has decreased. All right, if there's no questions, then I'll go on to the data. So obviously I'm using data from the Russian Longitudinal Monitoring Survey, and I'm using 18 rounds of data. So why am I using 18 rounds? It's because we use 5-year mortality as our indicator of mortality. So this just indicates whether or not an individual died within 5 years following their interview. And then how is mortality measured in the survey? So in each round, respondents are asked whether household members have died since the previous round. So then mortality is basically formed by the deceased household members basically form our reported deaths. And because of this setup, we also exclude single households, because in principle, there's nobody to report their deaths. So we do see that also single households sort of die in our sample, but the probability of them dying is a lot lower than individuals from multiple households, from 2-person or higher households. So for this reason, we exclude them. I should also say that the mortality trends that we find in the Russian Longitudinal Monitoring Survey are very similar to national Russian mortality trends, but the level is a bit lower, which could also be because we exclude single households. So we're going to decompose this gender difference in 5-year mortality as a function of lifestyles, and we're also going to add some socioeconomic, socio-demographic control variables like age, education, etc. But here you see the lifestyles that we want to focus on. So the frequency of alcohol consumption, smoking behavior, the frequency and intensity of leisure time exercise, and body mass index. Although in this presentation, I'm mostly going to be focusing, I'm only going to be focusing on the first two, on alcohol and smoking behavior, because I think these are the most important and they also give the most interesting results. All right, so then here you see some summary statistics of the sample that I'm using. So these are sample means by gender of the variables that I'll be using to decompose the gender gap in mortality. And here in the first 3 columns, we see the means for men and women in the early 2000s, and we also see the difference. And importantly, this is the difference of men minus women. So a positive difference basically means that the variable is, that the frequency is, or the mean or the frequency is higher among men. And here we see exactly the same for the early 2000s. And basically what we've observed with the life expectancy graph that I showed in the beginning, and also what we know from the literature, I basically see this also in my sample. So for example, I see that men are, in both periods, men are more likely to die within 5 years than women. But we also see that this has declined that this is lower, let's say, in the later period. So this mortality gap in this gender mortality gap has decreased over time. And interestingly, this is mostly the result due to a decline in male mortality, as we can see here. So female mortality actually increased slightly over this period. And then what I also see in my data is the unhealthier lifestyles of men. So as we see here, in both periods, men are more likely to drink alcohol at least once per week. Again, as shown by this positive difference. And men are also in both periods much more likely to smoke, so to be a current smoker than women. And interestingly, these differences are still here in the later periods, but they are smaller. And this is mostly due to a reduction in men's alcohol consumption and men's smoking or tobacco consumption, I should say. All right, so then I want to go over my methodology. So we're using Blinder-Waka type of decomposition method. So I'll go over that in a bit more detail in a bit, but basically what we're first doing is that we're just first regressing 5-year mortality on our lifestyles and our control variables using standard probit models. And we're doing this separately for men and women. So that is actually what the subscript J here stands for. And so from these models, we get the predicted probabilities of dying within 5 years for men and women. And then we use these mean probabilities to get at this so-called overall decomposition, which is shown here. So what we see here is the difference between the mean probability of dying within 5 years for men and the mean probability of dying within 5 years for women. So what we decompose here is really a positive mortality gap. So it's really the excess male mortality that we see here. And then we decompose this into two parts. We decompose this in an endowment effect and a coefficient effect. And basically, we decompose this into gender differences in endowments and gender differences in coefficients or behavioral responses, you could say, to the variables that I've added. And for this analysis, I'm basically interested in this endowment effect, because what we want to sort of research is how gender differences in lifestyles, and lifestyles are characteristics or endowments of individuals, influence the gender gap in mortality. So I will be focusing on this overall endowment effect and what does, for example, a positive endowment effect mean, or how should we interpret this? Well, basically, if this overall endowment effect is positive, it means that if men had all women's characteristics, so if they would drink less and if they would smoke less and all the other characteristics of the variables that I've added in the regressions, so if all men had women's endowments, then this would decrease the gender gap in mortality by the amount of this overall endowment effect. So this is quite nice. So then we get this division of the mortality gap into gender differences in endowments and gender differences in behavioral responses. But actually what we're particularly interested in is in finding this individual contribution of each lifestyle to this gender gap in mortality. And for this, we need so-called detailed decomposition. And here we're going to use this method created for nonlinear models by Judith. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to decompose this overall endowment effect into individual contributions of each of the explanatory variables, so that we can exactly see which part of the gender gap is explained, for example, by gender differences in alcohol, and which part is explained by gender differences in smoking behavior. And this is what is shown here. So how do we solve this? Basically, we're going to add weights to each of the individual to each of the individual variables. And basically the very nice thing is then that we can just express this gender gap in mortality as the sum of the different individual endowment effects and the different individual coefficient effects. And again, we're mostly interested in these individual endowment effects because we really want to see what or how much the gender difference in, for example, alcohol or smoking can explain, how much of that can explain the gender difference in the gender gap in mortality. All right, so then I want to go to my results. So this table sort of mimics the sample means table that I showed before. So first of all, again here, so I should first say that here we see first the results for the early 2000s, and here we see the results for the later periods. So what we first of all see is that we see very similar pattern than as we already saw in the sample in the summary statistics table. So we see here that in the early 2000s, men are 5.6 percentage points more likely to die than women. And a decade later, this gender gap has reduced. So a decade later, men are only 3.1 percentage points more likely to die than women. So this gender gap has indeed decreased over time. And then what I show here is this overall decomposition results, which I've just explained. And here below, we see the detailed endowment effects. So just to first go to this overall decomposition. So just again to explain what this exactly means. So in the early 2000s, we see an overall endowment effect of 0.02. So what does this mean? This means that if men had all women's characteristics, or if men had all women's endowments, then this would reduce the gender gap in 5-year mortality in the early 2000s by 2 percentage points. So this is quite a large effect. And we also see that in the early 2000s, this endowment effect has really decreased. So in the early 2000s, the gender differences in endowments can only explain approximately, 14% of the gender gap. So the importance, let's say, of gender differences in endowments for explaining the gender gap in mortality has really decreased in a decade. And now, obviously, we also want to see if we can see a similar pattern in the lifestyles. And this is what I show here. So this total lifestyle here is just the is just a sum of the individual endowment effects of alcohol consumption, smoking behavior, exercise, and body mass index. And indeed, what we see here is that we see a similar pattern. So we see that gender differences in lifestyles in the early 2000s could explain a gender gap of approximately 2.6 percentage points. But in a decade later, they cannot even explain a gender gap of 1 percentage point. So it really seems that gender differences in lifestyles have become less important for explaining the gender gap in mortality. And then lastly, I just want to look at which lifestyles sort of bring about this effect. So which of the lifestyles or which of the lifestyles make the largest contribution to this total lifestyle effect? And as it turns out, it's in our sample, it's actually smoking behavior. So we see that in the early 2000s, almost 45% of the gender gap could be explained by gender differences in smoking behavior. And this effect, a decade later, is still quite substantial. So in the early 2010s, the gender differences in smoking behavior can explain approximately 32% of the gender gap, which is still large, but it has decreased over time. And what is also interesting to see is that, well, perhaps a bit contrary to some of the literature, in my sample, gender differences in alcohol consumption don't explain much of the gender gap in 5-year mortality. They explain at most, 10% of the gender gap, and this is in the earlier period. But we do see that most of this effect is actually due to frequent or excessive alcohol consumption. So gender differences in consuming alcohol 4 to 7 times a week can explain just shy of 3% in both periods of the gender gap. All right, and if there's no questions, then I'd just like to go to the conclusion and discussion. So I think what we can conclude mainly from our table is that in our sample, smoking seems to really be the most important lifestyle factor, or in the sense that gender differences in smoking really, for a large part, can explain the gender gap in mortality, in 5-year mortality, in both time periods. And we also see that this gender gap in mortality has decreased over time, and this seems to go hand in hand with the decrease in the unhealthy lifestyles of, well, mainly smoking behavior and smoking behavior, and to a much lesser extent drinking behavior of Russian men. And if I have time, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but maybe I could just quickly say something about just the low effect that we find for gender differences in drinking in our sample. And well, quantitatively, this can just be explained by the low proportion of frequent drinkers that we have in our sample. So I think I only observed about 6% of Russian men in my sample which report to drink alcohol frequently, and I think not even 1% of women. And this could also be the case because, for example, we are excluding single households. So this also, well, is a question of the representativeness of the sample used in as well in this analysis. All right, I think that was everything that I wanted to say. So thanks for listening, and well, please let me know if you have any questions.
Judith, your microphone is.
Yep. You can either put up your hand in the chat, or you can put up your hand like this to ask questions or make comments. Pavel.
Yes. Hello, Lisa. Thank you very much. I think it's a beautiful piece of analysis. I have, I think, one comment and one question. So first comment is that basically what you could do, you could calculate the total amount of pure alcohol in the consumption by weighting the different beverages, similarly to how it is done in Yakovlev in AJ Applied. And then you get a single number for alcohol consumption, which is also comparable over time. So for instance, if you have a different composition of beverages over time, then my concern is that basically my main concern is that I don't understand what this coefficient effect is. So why men and women should have different coefficients. And one concern is that this coefficient effect is driven by some selection problem. And perhaps one way to reduce it is to normalize this alcohol consumption by calculating pure alcohol. Otherwise, you should say something about what this coefficient effect is. and how it can be explained. But otherwise, I think it's very nice. Thank you.
All right, many thanks for your comments. So I think what you said about the using the percentages of alcohol, I think I've looked at this a little bit and tried to do this, but I think I ran into problems about too many missing observations. So most people answer this question about frequency of alcohol consumption, but then not everybody answers what they drink and how often they drink. But I do like to point out maybe I should try and look into it a bit better. I also get your point about the coefficient effect. So I think how other papers have interpreted this is that it's basically, in this sense, it could also maybe relate a little bit to the lifestyle. So it could have to do with, for example, I have this category of current smoker, but you have current smokers who really smoke a lot, and you have current smokers who don't smoke as much. And then these differences in the coefficient effects for men and women could be because, for example, that there's stronger effects for men because they just smoke more throughout their lives. And this is exactly also what you say about the consumption of alcohol. Could also be indeed be that the frequencies don't pick up as much as we would like to, but that we really need to look a little bit better into if, for example, the effect is stronger in this category for men, then perhaps it is because they also drink more in one sitting than, for example, women. Indeed, yeah. So very good points. Thank you.
Okay, other comments and questions on this? Okay, I don't see any others. I have something quickly, which is that in doing this decomposition, there's one thing we're not getting at, we can't do inside Russia, and that is the extent to which the men are unusual and the women like women elsewhere. And I call your attention to something I don't think we have enough data from it because Lithuania is a small country, but it isn't very Russian and it most resembles Russia. And within the EU, it has the largest gap. It has many other things in common. The other thing I thought you might be able to, well, Pavel mentioned one of the readings. There's quite a lot on alcohol in Russia, attempting to figure out what's going on here, some of which has to do with binge drinking, some of which is measured inside the RLMS. So I think it's worthwhile you're incorporating into an article the amounts that have been done both within the RLMS and outside. But it seems to me that it's to get more out of this information, your decomposition, which is a contribution, you need to hook it up with the other things. The Yakovlev is particularly useful because it made use of something we can't do anymore. I call your attention to, which is that the RLMS is a very clustered sample, right? That's one of the reasons that our standard errors have to be bootstrapped usually. And as a consequence, Evgeny Yakovlev was able to figure out who was drinking together by people's birthdays. And if you wonder why you can't get anybody's date of birth anymore without getting a special application, that's why, because it was used to figure out who was drinking with whom. And it is that binge quality. There's also information, I will give you references. There's also information on, in addition to the binge drinking, on trying to estimate how accurate the reporting is. There was one very useful one with additional microdata done between St. Petersburg and Helsinki, which indicated that men in Russia, shockingly, inside the RLMS, overstate their alcohol consumption. And women, as you would expect everywhere in the world, and that's what happens, understate it. Most surveys have some estimate of that. And so it's useful to hook into that to add strength to your analysis. And also to look at the time trends, because at the start of the RLMS, I think it's fair to say women were not smoking in the same way. And I think that coming from the Netherlands, you may know that women, one way to diminish the gap between men and women is for women to take up smoking. And so you'll be able to look at that. And on age, though, I wonder how much of this and the Lithuanian life expectancy is biased by the fact that we still have very heavy deaths in the work capable ages. And that's where it's happening. And that's what makes both countries different. What you know, of course, that male mortality actually fell, life expectancy fell below 60. But that was done overwhelmingly by the heavy 30s, 40s in that period. So it's worth looking at that. But it's a nice step forward. Okay.
All right. Many
Other
thanks.
comments? Yeah. Other comments, people have other things that we want Lisa and to read and inform us on. You might be able to connect it with the Netherlands, in fact, because of the way in which it was the first country where the gap started really closing. I remember that, and it was because Dutch women were starting to smoke.
Yeah, I also see this in my sample a little bit, that indeed Russian women are smoking a bit more in the later periods. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So other people have comments and questions. Okay, the next one, Minsuk, do you want to put up these slides? Please.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Many thanks everybody for all the nice
Thank
comments.
you so much for this. We have one. We have one more on health coming after ours. Ours is not on health. It's about the birth rate, fertility. I see this as a demographic panel, and so we're going to divide the presentation. And here we go. And I feel a little awkward because I was assigned to chair at the same time that I was assigned to speak. So other people should yell if we take too long. We're going to try to be brief in this. So we get back to discussing health. Okay, so we'll start. Minsuk, you'll reel the slides forward. So the next slide. This is Judith Shapiro. I'm from LSE, and Minsuk was a student. He's now a graduate student in Korea, where the question of son preference was very acute. It's the only country that's turned around its sex ratio at birth. And on the other hand, it now has a birth rate below 1. And these are slightly connected, as we'll see. Okay, now our central research question, I'll present that first, actually came out of the RLMS and the very first users conference, which I see people here who were present at it. And during a plenary session, we were just chatting and discussing what had recently been revealed, which is the very, very striking son preference and manipulation, sex-selective abortion in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and to a lesser extent, Georgia, which resemble China and India. And that has declined, and I can call people's attention interesting papers I'm not discussing here on this, but we were of course fascinated by it as we were sitting and waiting. And a young woman who was not from Russia popped up and said innocently, "Isn't there son preference in Russia?" And there was a silence, and not being Russian, I was hesitant to fill the gap, but I finally said, yes, but there's also daughter preference, which is the conventional wisdom that all the experts here I see, social policy and demographers, know that we believe when we ask people that they want one of each, which is a very common Western European pattern, a son and a daughter. And as we know, I think for quite some period of time, people were having only one child. And so the question is, what did that look like? And this is not a fancy econometric exercise. We're going to do more of that now that we have we found a larger sample size than the RLMS, but is answering a very basic question. Okay, so next slide. Right. Okay, now this looks, if anybody has ever read How to Lie with Statistics by Darrell Huff, this looks like there's been an enormous increase in the ratio of boys to girls in Russia, isn't it? But it's actually only going through the 1.05 to 1.06. If people are not familiar with this, it's generally considered that somewhere between 1.04 males and 1.07 males are born per female in most countries. An exception, a notable exception, is Africa, where it is almost equal. And there are many fables that I'm not going into today about why it differs from country to country. I would explain some of this very simply. A sex ratio at birth of somewhere between 104 and 107, which Russia always lies in the center of. It's never gone beyond that. Some of these fables are just fables. Some of them are real, about boys born during wars and so on. But this can be easily explained, and this is health that you'll be aware of. I've mentioned it earlier. There has been a startling fall in infant mortality in Russia, which I believe we have not paid enough attention to. So I hope there will be a whole session at the next RLMS users conference on where this has come from. You know, is it in the later ages or the earlier ones? This is despite the fact that the definition was changed. And as a consequence, more very, very non-viable babies were born, most likely male. And in this period about 2010. And of course, well, people may not know that male infant mortality is everywhere in the world, that it is not manipulated by not calling the doctor on your girl children. Everywhere else, male infant mortality is much higher. So there hasn't been an abnormal sex ratio at birth. And the reason that we wondered about it, and it came out, is exactly that the explanation of this very, very high infant sex ratio at birth in Armenia and Azerbaijan especially was, and has been explained, a combination of Soviet abortion culture left over, in which abortion was simply the last method of contraception when everything else failed or wasn't there, and a very casual attitude, which we can now see is gone. But that met the technology that had not been present in anywhere in the Soviet Union, not even sex screening. And when the two came together, you got these rates that are higher than China and India, especially for the third child, where you get 140 boys, third children as boys, born for every 100. So what about Russia? It's just simply getting the question, is it happening at all? And the young woman who asked the question came up to me and said, didn't I think maybe it was happening because it was happening both ways? And so we've been able to see that, no, that's not happening either. Next slide. Okay. Now, Minsuk is going to take over on this one and explain it because he likes to do it. Most of you will probably believe, because it is intuitively, somehow it seems right, if we had what we call a sun-stopping rule, in which you kept on having children until you had a son, in a very strenuous way. Think of it as the way in which people try to have a child. That somehow that ought to lead to an imbalance in that sex ratio, and that's not true. But it's somewhat counterintuitive. Now, there are some very simple mathematical proofs with geometric regression. Instead of that, Minsuk will give you an intuitive demonstration of why you will not get an imbalance between males and females, even if everybody is dying to have a son, as long as they keep going, which is not what happens in Russia. You run out of space in your flat very quickly. Okay, yeah. So Minsuk.
Hi. So for simplicity here, here is the quick mathematical intuition behind why sun-stopping rule or sun preference may not present itself on total sex ratio at birth. So let us suppose there are 128 couples and all of them apply the sun-stopping rule with the probability of having a son as 0.5. On parity 1, 64 couples stop since they have boys, but the other 64 move on to parity 2, having had 64 daughters. At the next parity level, again, half of them stop parity progression since they got their son, whereas the other move on to parity 3 with 32 added to the population. So in this model, this rule continues on until everyone is satisfied. Then we can apply the sum of geometric series and quickly see that, in fact, as Seidel put it, son preference is a father of many daughters, sort of illustrating why a normal sex ratio at birth may not display the sex preference of the household, since in cumulative, the sex ratio is balanced.
Okay.
This tree diagram shows what material we worked it in principle. It is important to delve deeper into parity progression to understand the full household decision-making. And this is the visualization of our primary data constructed through the RLMS. We use fertility quasi-completed households to look at the children's sex and parity level. Fertility quasi-completed is using mothers ages 40 as opposed to 49. This is more widely used in the field, and this is largely just due to sample attrition. Going back to the tree diagram, each level of the tree represents the parity level. So the first level shows a number of households who had a son or a daughter. The next level shows the number of households who had a son or a daughter given the sex of the first child. For instance, here 756 households had a second son after having the first son. Essentially, this diagram illustrates that there are no real outliers in the RLMS sample in sex ratios on parity level. On parity progression 1, the sex ratio is 0.99. On parity progression 2, it is 1.06 and 1.01 respectively. But due to the sample size, it varies heavily on parity 3 in its sub-branches, ranging from 0.85 to 1.11. However, there is nothing out of ordinary in aggregate, yielding a sex ratio of 0.996 at parity level 3. We run some regressions using this data, and the first table shows the likelihood of having a second child given that you have a first. It shows that having a son or a daughter has no statistically significant impact on your likelihood of progressing to parity 3. What gets interesting is when we go from parity 2 to 3, as this table shows. Looking at parity 3, we use the family balancing preference to estimate the marginal likelihood of having a third child. In other words, you want one of each sex in your family, and you might have sort of another go if the first two are of the same sex. We see that having a same-sex pair of children makes you 3 percentage points more likely to progress onto parity 3. So we can apply this logic to RLMS. However, this effect is stronger when you have two sons over when you have two daughters, showing statistically significant likelihood of 4 percentage points more in parity progression 3. So the effect size of daughter preference is small, but definitely present in the sample. Over to Judith.
Okay, I need the next slide. Okay, now, if you start going through this tree diagram, which is our essential findings, it gets complicated, and comparing it with either time periods or across countries is difficult. And people who deal with son preference elsewhere in the world, where it's striking, have advocated a single really attractive number. And I would very much like to see, and do not think anywhere in the world there is a comparison of the sex ratio at last birth. That's the giveaway about whether you're stopping at sons or you're stopping at daughters. You may be surprised to know that there are countries, Sweden is one, where there is very clearly enough daughter preference now. That is, that the family is not stopping till there is a daughter. And that this one is one that will allow us immediately to have a snapshot to compare countries on the strength of son preference. I think I'll put in here what I have at the end, which is why worry about it so much if it's so slight. And I'm not focusing on this here, but we can discuss it. And this is where it does start to get more medically intense, that technology is evolving so that instead of having to think about abortion as a method, you begin to have subtle manipulations of the sex ratio. It's entirely legal in the United States, for example. It's not legal in Russia to have in IVF, in vitro fertilization, where you select And there are many other methods that are galloping ahead, so that slight preference could be exercised. And if people want to see the consequences of that, they should look at some of the data on China and what it means when you have a serious excess of males in their 20s. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think I worry every time that there's a flare-up, and we've just seen one, because we've got 20 excess males on each side, age about 18, and this can be dangerous. So that's why this very subtle preference might make a difference. How it means the other way, I'm not sure either. So this single one is there, but we have a problem. Why did we bother with the RLMS? We're just at the edge, which is why it took so many years. We're just at the edge of having enough statistical power to tell. We just don't have a large enough sample. And you'll see that when we look at what happens to people who've had 2 daughters. And so consequently, if we have the next slide, Minsuk, consequently, we tried to do our best with this. We know that the data exist, but they would have to be downloaded and used. It did turn out, and we were not aware of this, is the sort of thing that happens to some of us, and you're probably familiar with it. Almost everybody submitted their paper on the 15th of April. I have the dates of it. A few people were ahead of the game, and we did. And then just at that point, a really fine paper was published, which goes through our sort of tree diagram, essentially, without the visualization, for a number of countries of Eastern Europe. It doesn't use the sex ratio at last birth. It doesn't look at the outcomes. It simply looks at what happens if you have a son or a daughter in different countries using the 5 or 10% samples from the census. And this happened 2 weeks afterwards. So we have a paper that gives us much larger numbers. Having looked at it in detail, the RLMS comes out very well. So it's worth knowing that, just for all the other things we do, that the RLMS is a pretty nice sample that way in terms of the broad patterns. It's not exact, and it allows us to start thinking about looking at education levels. In Britain, it is required that the government monitor all ethnic minorities to make sure that they're not manipulating the sex ratio at birth. And up till 2007, that was happening. And it was educated South Asian women who were sneaking off to have a daughter, basically, and on the 3rd child again. So you need to look at all of those. And in Russia, as you know, there haven't been many 3rd children recently. So it's a very sensitive measure. And what we find is very similar to what this larger paper finds. Next slide, Minsuk. Yeah. Minsuk, next slide. Yeah. Okay, those are the numbers, right? You want to explain them? Yeah.
So we use both RLMS and IPOMS data to estimate the sex ratio at last birth, which is estimated as 1.01 for the RLMS and 1.045 for the IPOMS. We test this against the overall sex ratio at birth of 1.06 in Russia. For both of the data sets, it is statistically significant that the sex ratio at last birth is lower than 1.06. Statistically more powerful IPOMS data confirms our initial hypothesis formed from the RLMS dataset that there exists daughter preference, or at the very least non-existence of son preference in Russia. And Judith will now just wrap up.
Yeah. Okay, now what we mean by daughter and son preference is not the manipulation of the sex ratio at birth. I want to underscore that, right? That is the new way internationally that people are starting to look at it, including the United States, is to say, given that you have a daughter, how likely is it you're going to have a second child? Given that you have 2 daughters or 2 sons, how likely it is. This is revealed preference. I know there are present at this conference excellent sociologists who think that it's very silly to do it this way, but economists know that we don't ask people, we observe what they do. And I mean, we try to speak a common language with the people who ask people what they prefer. And in this, what we do see demonstrably are two things. One of them is that at all these different parities, even when people, when it looks like having two sons, you are more likely to have a third child. Nonetheless, there is no difference in the sex ratio at birth. People are not manipulating that third child to make sure it's a daughter. They're just having another roll of the dice. And that has, as a consequence, something that we could go back to the RLMS with. Polina, who is here, did a pioneering study on this. Nobody really believed that Soviet abortion culture was dying. And the RLMS seemed to indicate that it was. It was dying slowly, but it was going. And that we could believe the statistics on this. And that's what we seem to be coming out with, despite the fact, which I think we should look at, that as the paper that I mentioned, the ISA paper emphasizes, if we look at things like the European Values Survey, it looks like the professed views of Russians are much more gender stereotyped than other countries. So I think, again, we could look back at the RLMS and observe that despite the statements that women don't really need a job, Russian women work. Despite the statements that they should stay home with the children, they don't, and so on. And that the economist's way of looking at revealed preference is much more useful. So in sum, in that question, no, there isn't son preference. There may be daughter preference. There isn't manipulation of the sex ratio at birth. Abortion culture really has almost gone. It's still higher, but it's not the highest rate in Europe now. And we should be aware of all of those things and begin to explore further how to make the RLMS give us more information, because it can tell us much more and in fine detail. I will add that on the census data, that they have the same headache that the RLMS can have in trying to figure out who is the mother in the household, if the children have left, and so on. And that we could do a better job if we emulated some of the Nordic countries and had better rosters of families than we do have. And it's something we might want to consider, and that tonight's talk on how to use the RLMS will show us how to do also. So those are our conclusions. There's no evidence of overall son preference. There's the, disappointingly maybe, the standard story that's been told for a generation that the ideal Russian family has one of each is still there. It's the one. Given the government's intense efforts to increase the birth rate, I will note as well that the absence of a very strong preference one way or the other means smaller families. And therefore, because you don't keep going. And there's no skewed ratio. We still have to watch out what begins to happen. But as far as I can see, unlike, for example, Ukraine, Russia has not had any tilting or technological tweaks to try to arrange the sex of children. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much. Questions and comments? Yes. See if I see any little blue hands. I don't see any. Everybody satisfied? Or they think it's a trivial question? Pavel, you look like you're about to say something.
I'm not sure. No, I was wondering about the heterogeneity. I mean, between rural and urban areas, and between, let's say, Asian and European Russia.
Yeah. No, it's exactly the absence of statistical power that prevents our doing it. Minsuk kept trying to divide them in various ways, and I kept saying, but you can't tell. We can sometimes, by waiting in the RLMS, get enough. That happened with mortality. For the first 10 years of the RLMS, we tried to tell things about mortality and we couldn't. The sort of things that Lisa can do now. So I believe we might get somewhere with it, but we will need a larger sample. It looks suggestive that there have been shifts, yes. But and I would like to see it by education level as well, as I said. But the heterogeneity is somewhat limited by the very fact that there are such small families in Russia. If people are not aware of it, they should look elsewhere. I don't mean the average size. I mean the absence of, everybody knows, I think here, right, that 3 children was defined in Moscow as mnogodetnaya a long time ago. And that's sort of humor in a way in a country where it's typical for reasonably well-off middle-class families to have 3 children. So everybody has it. And instead, we don't have 5 children families. But heterogeneity is very important, absolutely. And it can make the big difference in Armenia and Azerbaijan, for all we know. In fact, some of the interesting papers that have come out have suggested that you can see this, that a certain subgroup is doing the moving of that. That's why we need a larger sample size. Nobody else? We can move on to.
I can see Alexandra and Teresa have questions.
Diana.
Okay.
I have a question. I wonder if we take into account when a man or woman has a child from the previous marriage. Does that matter if they have a daughter or son from the previous marriage? Does it influence to their preferences in sons and daughters?
It's a great question that we can't answer in most of the data available. And the reason for that is that it's taken basically from a household, and you have to figure out what has happened. And that is where, if you read the human fertility database underlying it, you'll see the limits on the Russian knowledge that we have, because it's very important in Russia, just as the relatively frequent dissolution of marriages is important. But we simply don't have that data for most countries. Russia is not an outlier in this. We don't follow it well enough. We care a lot. We have policies that cost a fortune, and we don't monitor it because we use the conventional survey methods, and we don't ask people to please fill in this chart. So in fact, when we did this, we had no notion even of the gender ratio by parity in Russia in a macro level, let alone micro, as you're asking. It's a very good question.
Judith, there are 2 more people, Teresa and Yana.
Oh yeah, thanks, sorry, I was trying to do 2 things, so 3 things at
Yeah.
once. Okay, so please.
Teresa.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. I have two small questions, and one is it was probably me who wasn't focused enough, but I wasn't sure I understood why you concluded that there's no selective abortion, because you said that's is that from your analysis? Well, sorry if I didn't understand the explanation.
Yeah, let me be clear that you can't say no. It's not significant. Okay, it does not show up in the sex ratio of the children.
And that would be the sex ratio of the last child, is it?
That's right. Or of any child of a given parity, right? If everybody was having had a daughter, wanted a son, it would show up in the second child. Yeah, as a generalization, it shows up in most of the countries with an extreme ratio. It shows up in the third child. And what we don't have, which was correctly pointed out, was we don't have the early years when abortion was more common in Russia, and yet technology had been put in place so that you could tell early enough. So we're not saying there's none, simply that it does not show up in the ratios.
Yeah, and that would be the fact that the ratios are within the 1.04 and the 1.07.
That's right. You would have to, up to 1.07, it tends to be admitted as not showing anything. I myself am doubtful sometimes about that. Singapore, year in and year out, and it's a small country, so you have to wait, but it has a 1.07. And given that it comes from that background of Confucianism, I'm surprised that people think nothing is going on. But nonetheless, that's the only way you can tell, other than actual reporting on the frequency of abortions. If you want to look at Vika Savage's work, you can see that abortion is decreasing, continuing to do so. But that doesn't mean there's no sex selective abortion, of course. Again, it's not seen in that way, right? It's we've got a third child, we didn't want to have the child, we'll decide whether to have the child, and then we find out that it's a girl, or we find out that it's a boy. That's how it happens, right? So it's circumstantial evidence, if you like, but it would be it would show up. It would show up even in the RLMS if it were there.
Thank you very much. And the other thing is, I would be curious, I'm not sure you probably cannot say that with your data, certainly not with this analysis, is about differential preference by birth order. So imagine that you would like, if you have only one, you'd like the boy, but by the time you have the two boys, the girl is also nice.
Yeah, yes. And in fact, someone else has pointed out, in some sense, speaking of it as preference may be extreme. Suppose that in fact, what's moving everybody who has a daughter, only a son, to have a second child isn't that they must have a daughter, but that they love their son so much they want more kids.
Yeah.
And we can't tell the causality in that directly. That's where the sociologists asking people why they've had the children and everything else comes into play. We're only looking at what it looks like. Okay, it's a very simple statistic, but it is one that's rather powerful if you look at not just countries around the world, but bordering on Russia. And the people who've looked at Azerbaijan and Armenia have looked very carefully at the Northern Caucasus, where you saw a slight trace, but it disappeared. Pavel, I think you want to speak again?
Thank
No,
you.
yes, you do. Your language suggests it, but you don't want to say anything. Anybody else?
Yes, Yana.
Yana.
Да, прошу прощения, я буду говорить по-русски, иначе мы очень долго будем с моим уровнем английского. Да, я первое хотела поблагодарить за очень интересный доклад. Мне, наверное, не пришло бы в голову, что в России действительно может быть даже предпочтение пола ребенка, по крайней мере, когда люди должны решать на уровне уже отказаться от ребенка, который уже зачат. Потому что когда я была молодая, и вот мы сами ждали ребенка, то да, вот среди большого количества молодежи, это был конец 80-х, все больше хотели мальчиков, и у нас родилась девочка, мы были очень счастливы, это было не очень типично. Но, конечно, никто на тот момент, ну или мало было таких возможностей, чтобы отказаться от того ребенка, которого ты уже ждешь именно из-за пола. Ну вот эта постановка, она, мне кажется, действительно очень интересная. Я рада, что получились такие результаты, что действительно у нас не отказываются от мальчиков и девочек. То есть всех детей мы, наверное, любим. Но у меня есть несколько соображений, что, может быть, я пропустила, но что, мне кажется, было бы интересно учесть. Это поскольку Россия очень, ну, русских больше всего, конечно, но все-таки это многонациональная страна, разные конфессии есть. Вот мне думается, что это было бы интересно учесть. Может быть, мусульманские республики или сами национальности, склонные к мусульманству, да, или конфессия, может быть, здесь имеют определенное влияние, хотя, как правило, здесь, наверное, есть противоречие, что, может быть, по каким-то причинам они предпочитали бы мальчиков, но, скажем, для них недопустим аборт, да. Но, во всяком случае, мне кажется, это было бы интересно проверить. И вторая вещь, может быть, это в динамике было бы интересно посмотреть. Да? Что-то я услышала, какой-то звук. И вторая вещь, которая, мне кажется, могла бы быть важной, это может быть, я не знаю, дадут ли данные РЛМС для этого возможность посмотреть, влияет ли на положение пожилых то дочка у них или сын, потому что на самом деле, ну, помимо каких-то нравственных, не знаю, моральных, может быть, скорее, предпочтений мальчиков или девочек, мы как экономисты все-таки должны учитывать, что если мы возьмем отдачу от ребенка, то, может быть, в пожилом возрасте, и тут люди могут это учитывать. И тут могут быть совершенно разные эффекты, потому что, с одной стороны, сыновья в среднем должны больше зарабатывать, но, с другой стороны, дочери в среднем, опять же, по России, может быть, оказывают большую поддержку не материальную, а и психологическую, и помощью какой-то, и так далее, и так далее. Поэтому, мне кажется, вот этот факт тоже можно было бы попробовать как-то пересечь вот с этим предпочтением мальчиков и девочек. Но мне было очень интересно. Еще раз большое-большое спасибо.
Just briefly, so I think your observations on the fatalism of is it a boy or a girl fit very much with the data. So you weren't as unusual as you thought. And that's why as economists, we're doubtful when we ask people what they want, because it turns out that what they had and got, you don't want to say they didn't want it. But again, we need a larger sample size to tell some of these questions. Certainly in terms of the ethnicity question. You'll see for Azerbaijan and Armenia, which have two very different backgrounds, that you don't see a difference. And around the world, where I have done a survey on sex selectivity with students, and we've looked at hundreds of studies, that essentially, surprisingly, some Islamic countries have a daughter preference, some have a son preference. Inside Malaysia, which has both, it's the Islamic section that is more likely not to have son preference, surprisingly. So we have surprises in front of us if we keep our eyes open. And it's very valuable for, I think, for people to contribute their own observations on what it was like when they had the children, so that we know where to look for it. Other speakers on this question. I hope people will write us and give their own views on it so that we can formulate it and target it there. Okay, so I think that's it for this one. And yes, we'll move on to the third, which is health, but it's also demography in a different way because we're dealing with migrants. And I'm very curious, to put it mildly, to see the results on this one. So there we are. It's three very different countries. And Ekaterina, you're going to present it, yes?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
and co-authors are listed. And you're now at UCL and a neighbor, but that's not, of course, where it started. So there we are, the healthy immigrant effect.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. So yeah, my name is Ekaterina. I'm currently a research associate at Comprehensive Clinical Trials Unit at UCL. And this paper was a part of my PhD thesis, which I did at City University of London, and it is written together with my supervisors. So briefly, the outline should be very familiar. So we'll start with some introduction. I will hopefully provide a good motivation for why we chose this topic, then briefly discuss some related literature, go through the data, which we obviously all know very well, empirical strategy, results, and conclusion. So existing literature provides evidence of the so-called healthy immigrant effect. It's when immigrants arrive healthier than the native population, on average, but then their health deteriorates more, so at a faster pace than health of natives over time. And specifically, the health converges to the level of natives usually in about 10-15 years. At least that's what the evidence shows us. And the health advantage is usually attributable to difference in culture, in attitudes and norms, and education. But in this paper, we aim to explore if this health advantage is still present if there is no cultural difference between immigrant and native population. And for this purpose, we compare immigrants who arrived in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we compare them with native Russian citizens and also with the immigrants who arrived before the collapse. So as you will see, we'll define them as economic immigrants. So those political immigrants who arrived after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we hypothesize that they arrived due to exogenous political reasons, and they were mostly ethnically Russian. They were not different from natives in terms of their education and language proficiency. So just to visualize how we divide immigrants, so the political immigrants, again, they arrived after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the tensions began, and many people were forced to leave the republics of the Soviet Union and move to the current territory of the Russian Federation. And then those who arrived before 1989, we define as economic immigrants, so those who just decided to move to the territory of the Russian Federation for reasons like, you know, better job prospects or better lifestyle or something like this. So yeah, basically the questions which we want to answer is if this healthy immigrant is going to be present generally in the immigrants in the Russian Federation, same as it's been seen in other papers, and if this is true also for political immigrants specifically. And the collapse of the Soviet Union itself provides us with the environment of some sort of quasi-natural experiment. Again, because we believe that political immigrants moved due to some exogenous reasons, and they're also very similar to the native population. This sort of experiment has been used already by one of the researchers at the Higher School of Economics. So this idea was taken by us to look at specifically the healthy immigrant effect in this paper. So what has been done already on this topic? There isn't many existing studies which looked specifically at this question, but there is one study which did use the Russian data, but importantly, this data at that point was cross-sectional. And the authors found that all foreign-born individuals, except those from Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, they report better health than the native-born. So they did see some healthy immigrant effect going on in this health advantage of immigrants. The evidence from other countries suggests that immigrants are healthier when they arrive, and then their health converges over time to the native population. So the data, there isn't much to say here, just that specifically we used in this paper the data from the waves 15 to 21. So at the point when I did the analysis, 21 waves were available. So these are years 2010 to 2016. This way we had a large enough sample of immigrants, and for these immigrants we also had to know their year of arrival and country of origin. So our analytical sample here was about 3,000 individuals, and we had unfortunately only about 200 foreign-born individuals in this sample. So we will move to some summary statistics, so just describing the data and what exactly we were looking at. Here I show the country of birth, yeah, in this table, and we attempted to account for the cultural differences, and we divided the immigrants also in two groups. So those who arrived from Eastern European countries, we believe they're closer in culture and religion to the native Russian population. and then the Islamic countries which are maybe more distant. So you can see here what the first group includes and what the second one includes, just so that I don't have to repeat it. And these are only immigrants who arrived after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these are just the political immigrants who we divided in this way. And so what are we interested in here is the health outcomes. And specifically it's reporting good health, reporting some health problems in the last 30 days, disability, chronic condition, and then some health behaviors as well, such as obesity, smoking, drinking alcohol, and a more general like a welfare outcome, which is a life dissatisfaction. Why we call it life dissatisfaction? Just because of the way the variable is coded. It's going to be easier to understand. As the value increases, it means that dissatisfaction increases. So that's going to be just more straightforward to look at the numbers. So what can we see from this table is that immigrants are not very different from the native population with respect to most of the health outcomes. There are some differences which we can notice, for example, that immigrants are less likely to be disabled and they're more likely to smoke. And immigrants from Islamic countries, what we call it, have lower BMI compared to native Russians. And then Eastern European immigrants have lower life dissatisfaction. So they seem to be happier with their life. This is just the data from one wave, from the first wave which we used. So we're not controlling for any time effects here. And also, as you can imagine, we're looking at people who arrived after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the data is starting from 2010. So of course, we probably would not expect the groups to be too different much at this stage. And when we're looking at it like this in a cross-sectional fashion. And we also looked at the social demographic information just to see if our hypothesis is realistic, if indeed the political immigrants who arrived after the collapse of the Soviet Union are really similar in terms of education and other social demographic characteristics. And indeed, immigrants are not different from the native population with respect to education and income. And these two variables usually have a large effect on health and health behaviors. So here our hypothesis works. And immigrant group at the same time is also younger. It has higher proportion of women, which is quite different from the usual portrait of immigrant in other countries. Immigrants are more likely to be married and less likely to be unemployed. And here we do not have a variable for language proficiency, but we just assume that it would be the same, again, just because of the educational standards back in the USSR. And so then on these graphs, it's still a descriptive statistics, but here we aim to account for several important factors. So this is not just cross-sectional data anymore. We're looking at age, nativity, and reason for migration. So you can see here how the variables change over time by age group and by the reason for migration. So we have the graphs for the total population, for separately native-born individuals, for political and economic immigrants. And what can we see from here? So we're looking at usually the time trends, if there's any change over time happening, if there is increase or decrease in variables with age groups as well. So what we can say here in terms of change over time, that only the probability of reporting good health is seems to be increasing over time, but time doesn't have an effect on other self-assessed health measures. But all measures seem to be increasing with age, and that's expected, as usually people have poorer health, so they're more likely to have health problems, chronic conditions, and disability as they age. And political immigrants have higher probability of reporting health problems and chronic conditions than native population. And economic immigrants, if we look at them, they're more likely to have disability. So it seems that there is something going on actually in the opposite direction than we would expect. It doesn't look like there is health advantage, but rather health disadvantage in immigrants compared to native population. And then if we're looking at the health behaviors, so again, obesity, smoking, alcohol consumption, then there is some tendency of obesity increasing over time, but this trend is not very pronounced overall. But with respect to smoking and alcohol, we see that the overall trend is going down the levels. So this suggests that the population generally leads healthier lifestyle over time. Obesity and alcohol consumption, they rise with age of individuals. This is true for the native population, for political immigrants. The interesting point here is that economic immigrants have the opposite direction with respect to obesity. It declines with age. This could be potentially a sign of healthy assimilation, as with time, it seems that economic immigrants are getting healthier. Both economic and political immigrants, they have higher level of obesity compared to the native population, and the same is true for alcohol consumption. So even though overall there is a trend for healthier lifestyle, but it looks like that immigrants tend to lead less healthy lifestyle compared to the native population. And again, with life dissatisfaction, it is specifically dissatisfaction, not satisfaction, yeah, when we're looking at the graphs. And it does seem to have a bit of a U shape in terms of change over time. So it goes down from 2010 to 2013 when we're looking at it, but then it rises in 2016. And so this could possibly correspond to some external reasons like the conflict with Ukraine in 2014 and the sanctions which were imposed against Russia and increased exchange rates and the overall quality of life. So it seems that people become also more dissatisfied with life as they age, and political immigrants have higher levels of dissatisfaction. So there is some difference in the dissatisfaction between immigrants and native population. And so overall, what we were trying to obtain from these graphs, if it's still a descriptive statistics, is just some proof that it is worth going into modeling, and if there is any difference between the immigrants and natives in general, and then political and economic immigrants, if we can still see some differences, if it's worth doing the modeling. And it does look like there are some differences, and we will try to explain them further with our empirical strategy. So we had a lot of specifications and estimated a lot of different types of models. But just to make it brief, we were trying to account for 3 changes which take place simultaneously. That's why this topic is quite hard to explore and then to disentangle all the effects. So what's happening is aging of both immigrants and native population. There is growing duration of stay for immigrants in Russia, and then there are historical trends of some health outcomes, specifically obesity, smoking, and drinking. So all this is going on at the same time, and we're trying to account for all these trends. This model, which I'm showing here, it assumes a linear effect of years since migration on health outcomes, and then what we want to identify from here is the effect of 1 more year spent in Russia on health status and health behaviors. But we also aimed to control for other things. So we believe that there may not be a linear effect of the duration of stay. So we assume also non-linear effect. We look at the interaction of duration of stay with age at migration, if that does matter, when at which point of time in their lives people arrived in Russia. Also interaction with the country of origin, again, due to some cultural differences, especially in terms of health behaviors, that's likely to have an effect. And then we also interacted duration of stay, country of origin, and assumed nonlinear effect of the duration. So our preferred model is linear probability model, simply because it is easier to interpret the results from the regression models compared to the probit model. But as a robustness check, we also estimated a set of probit models, and I can tell you that the results were very similar. So there is no point of complicating ourselves and going for a more complicated model. Of course, linear probability model does have a limitation of it not accounting for the fact that the probability can only take values between 0 and 1. And you will see on some of our graphs that it does go in the negative part. But again, because of the simplicity of the interpretation, we still kept the linear probability model. And also what we did is our preferred model was the correlated random effects model, because we do have the panel data. So we account for some unobserved individual heterogeneity over time, because we follow individuals over time. And in the random effects model, so we have the individual effects, which are random variables, but the assumption, which is not very realistic for us here, is that these random individual effects, they need to be independent of the regressors and of the errors. And again, it's unrealistic because these characteristics which we control for, they're likely to correlate with unobserved characteristics, which we don't have here, of individuals, such as ability or risk attitude, family background, etc. So we clearly would like to control for more variables, which we do not have in the model. And so we used the approach by Moodlach and Chamberlain. This model adds some group means of variables that vary between individuals. So at least we relax this assumption. And so we can go briefly through the results, because you can imagine from estimating all these models, there are a lot of tables with regression results. But what I think is more intuitive is just to look at the predicted probabilities, which are coming from our preferred model, which is, again, the correlated random effects model, again, linear probability model. And we are looking here at the difference over time. The graphs which we also made is controlling for the age at arrival and country of origin. But again, there will be not only too many tables, but too many graphs. So we'll look at these briefly, and then I will summarize all the results which we got from estimating the all the models. So we observed that immigrants have consistently worse health than natives. So the self-reported health seems to be lower. Specifically, political immigrants, they have higher probability of having health problems and disability. And economic immigrants are reversed, so they have better outcomes, even though they spend more time in Russia and they're being older, but they have better outcomes than the native population when we control for age and other characteristics. That still stays true. And then for health behaviors, there is this overall trend which we've seen towards healthier lifestyle, but political immigrants are more likely to be obese than the native population, and economic immigrants are more likely to be obese and smoke as well. So even though, again, there is the overall trend for healthier lifestyle, immigrants have less healthy lifestyles than natives. And with the life dissatisfaction, again, it's maybe a little bit confusing. So we have native individuals are the most satisfied with their life, and political immigrants are the least satisfied when we're looking at the predicted probabilities. So if we look at all the results, in general, we see that there seems to be a health disadvantage rather than health advantage in the immigrant group compared to the native population. So just to summarize the results with respect to the research question, there is some support of healthy immigrant effect in the economic immigrant subgroup, and there is only partial support of that in political immigrant subgroup. And as I mentioned, we controlled also for the age of arrival and the country of origin, and this seems to have some protective effects. So if people are arriving at younger age and Islamic country origin did have some protective effect on the assimilation. So they tend to have healthier assimilation over time compared to those who arrived in older age, or those who arrived from Eastern European countries. So I think that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'll be happy for any questions or feedback. Can go back to the conclusion maybe.
Oh, questions and comments? Yes, yes, Silas. Yes.
First of all, thanks a lot for the nice presentation you had. I didn't follow through completely because I had some technical issues, but then in your empirical strategy, I realized you have a panel data set, and then in the models you use, I was wondering why didn't you use fixed effects in your analysis?
Well, that's not really possible for me because what I'm interested in is the years since migration, which changes over time. This is not fixed, so that just doesn't work for this specific research question. But I see where you're coming from. I wish
I get it. I was a bit puzzled given that you had at individual level and you had a time dimension, but then probably I was confused at some point, but thanks for the clarification.
There is a lot to take in.
I have my hand raised, but I'm not sure.
Yes, yep.
Visible. Hi, thanks for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. First, I'm curious, since Lisa also got in her presentation questions about the definition of alcohol consumption. So now I'm curious, how did you define it in your paper? Was it also with frequency variable?
Yeah, it is all binary outcomes here. I probably should have mentioned that. So we're always looking at the probability. So here is the probability of having 4 or more drinks a week.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so the highest frequency, which it was there in the data.
The highest category, yes. And then I have just one small, not that you have to do even more, but I can't, I'm biased because we're looking at mortality. So now I'm curious if you also considered looking at the mortality as an outcome for the group.
Yes, we did consider a lot of outcomes. There's just so much which you could look at. It's just because, we're focusing on the healthy immigrant effect, which is usually looking at some health outcomes like the self-assessed health. That's the most common, just how do you rate your health rather than the mortality specifically. But I think, that would be a nice addition.
Yeah, to see if it's in line or if there could also be some reporting issues going on with the other variables that you wouldn't have with mortality. So just lastly, just if you could clarify, I wonder what your main goal then is it to describe the different groups or to understand the composition in terms of health of the different groups, or is it to understand different behaviors of these different groups of immigrants and the natives once they arrive there? Is it clear what I mean? So to try to understand how different, is it that the immigrants are healthy or is it that they behave differently after arriving in Russia?
Yeah, what we would ultimately want is sort of divergence or convergence from the native population. Yeah, so once they arrive, at which point are they? Are they healthier or are they not? And then what happens? Are they getting more like the native population or are they different? So that's what usually happens. It's just quite difficult to get this effect, which is specifically due to immigration, due to this time, and not due to other trends. So sometimes, in papers, you see that the authors are claiming that they're getting this, but then there can be a lot of criticism, endless amount of limitations you can find. So that's what we would like to do. So that's why we're looking here, this effect of 1 year. So what happens if you spend 1 more year in Russia? And we don't only focus on one outcome because it feels like it doesn't tell the story. So self-assessed health is one thing, but then how do behaviors change? And also it would be good to know, with which behaviors they come from. So at the point when they arrived, did they have a healthy lifestyle, or did they already smoke and were obese and so on? So that's what always hard to get, is the starting point. That's why all this, controlling, dividing them into groups by country of origin, just to have an idea where they stand at this point. But yeah, it's very hard to disentangle all this. I hope I answered your question. Or
yeah, no, you did, and it's definitely nice you're looking at all the different outcomes. Thanks.
Hi. Sorry.
Minsuk, yes.
Okay. What's the possible mechanism behind why these political immigrants suddenly sort of become really unhealthy? I mean, it seems quite weird when they have a sort of at a higher, they arrive at a healthier state and then they quickly sort of deteriorate.
Unfortunately, we don't follow them from the moment they arrived, and that would be the perfect data set. But it's not the first paper which is doing precisely that. This has been done in the literature, and that's just this huge limitation, which as for now, we can't overcome. So it is hard to tell how they arrived. That's what usually seen in the literature, that they arrive healthier and then it deteriorates. And again, the mechanism, just as you're saying, that's what comes from the empirical studies, but the empirical studies don't always tell you what's the mechanism behind it. So that's what we were trying to look at by looking at not only the self-assessed health, but at the behaviors as well, just to see maybe they start smoking because they come to Russia and that's why their health is worse. What we see from this data, that it seems that they have less healthy lifestyle at the point when we observe them. But the overall trend is going up. So I would like to say what the mechanism is, and I still do believe that it is health behaviors, in my personal opinion, but I don't know how much proof of that I can give with the data.
Also, just a second point is, do they become unhealthier than the native population, or do they sort of converge onto sort of the negative health levels of native population, or do they go even worse?
It looks like, yeah, that they are still on the lower levels. So they have lower health overall, and they have the less healthy behaviors at this point when we observe them. So they could have started anywhere, but at this point when we see, this snapshot of these years, they are doing worse.
Okay, thank you.
Other comments, including general ones about where we should be going next in taking the RLMS in these interesting directions, a lot of which are, how to put it, on the international agenda, like this one, in which the healthy immigrant question is important to other people. I should add that I always joke, but it's not funny, that a reason I emigrated from Russia was that I was aware of this effect, and I did not want to converge to the life expectancy of a 60-year-old Russian. And that was on accident levels, by the way. That is, I nearly slipped under the wheels of a neighbor's car in a snow. And I wondered about your control variables too. That would be interesting to see, because in my collection of anecdotal evidence, the quote political immigrants were often forced into rural areas because that was where they could no longer trade a flat in Ashgabat for even a provincial Russian city, and they ended up in the vacant rural property. And as we know, that remains has a high accident level, which will give us a real shortening of life expectancy if a 33-year-old falls under a tractor. So this is really valuable. I'm surprised, I was pleasantly surprised to see that you had the statistical power to do all this. Because in Britain, we don't catch enough immigrants in our general surveys. And it's obviously a tribute to the RLMS that it has managed to do it.
Yes, indeed. I did use the Understanding Society panel survey for my other papers, and the sample size is also not very high. In general, for these studies, it seems that it's not very high.
Yeah, that's exactly what, I mean, some of our students were very frustrated with that. But maybe that's part of our illusion about how many immigrants there are as well. Okay, more questions and comments before we wrap up. We're going to have a very interesting, in an hour, we have a very interesting and important talk. I think that this is what some of us come for as well, is to learn to use the RLMS better. And Jana Roshina will help us do that in an hour. So you can stay and have breakout rooms if you want, or we can have a break. Okay, any more final comments? Nope. Okay, well, let me thank the other speakers very, very much, and especially also our technical staff and the translators and everyone else and the organizers for a fantastic job so far. It's actually harder to do than the live bodies and the coffee and the donuts, and it's been quite something so far. Okay, so I'll hope to see you this evening, whatever time you're on, otherwise tomorrow morning as well. Okay, thanks.